February 1959. Deep in the frozen Ural Mountains of the Soviet Union, 9 experienced hikers vanished into the night. When rescuers finally found their campsite, something felt wrong immediately. The tent had been sliced open from the inside. Their boots were still there. Their supplies were untouched. And the group had apparently fled into a brutal snowstorm, half naked. What happened next would become one of the most disturbing mysteries in modern history. Because the bodies were not simply frozen. Some had crushed ribs. One was missing her tongue. Another had severe skull fractures. And the Soviet government quietly closed the case with a single, terrifying explanation. An unknown, compelling force. More than 60 years later, nobody fully agrees on what happened on that mountain. This is the story of the Dyatlov Pass incident. The group was made up of young Soviet hikers and ski trekkers, most of them students from the Ural Polytechnical Institute. These were not amateurs. They were highly experienced survivalists, trained to endure brutal winter conditions. The expedition was led by 23-year-old Igor Dyatlov, a respected and disciplined outdoor leader. The others included engineers, students, and former military personnel. They were energetic, intelligent, and adventurous. Photographs from the trip show them laughing, building campfires, and joking together in the snow. Nothing about the early days of the expedition suggested tragedy. Their goal was ambitious but achievable, a difficult ski trek across the northern Ural Mountains. At the time, completing the route would earn them a prestigious Grade 3 certification, the highest level available in the Soviet Union. The team departed in late January 1959. One member, Yuri Yudin, became sick early in the journey and turned back. That decision likely saved his life. He would become the only survivor of the expedition. The remaining 9 hikers continued deeper into the wilderness and into history. The hikers traveled through forests buried in snow, battling freezing winds and dangerous terrain. But morale remained high. Recovered journals and cameras revealed smiling faces and playful moments. One photo showed the group joking around with skis. Another showed them struggling through deep snowdrifts. These images would become haunting later, because they were some of the last moments the hikers would ever record. On February 1st, the team reached the slopes of a mountain called Kholat Syakul. The name came from the local Mansi people. Translated loosely, it meant Mountain of the Dead. Despite worsening weather conditions, Dyatlov decided to pitch camp on the open slope instead of moving into the protection of the nearby forest. Snowfall intensified. Visibility became poor. The temperature dropped far below freezing. That night, something happened. Something so terrifying that 9 experienced survivalists abandoned their tent and ran into the darkness. When the group failed to return on schedule, concern slowly began to grow. At first, nobody panicked. Experienced hikers often returned late. But after several days without communication, rescue teams were sent into the mountains. What they found made no sense. The tent was still standing partially under the snow, but it had been cut open from the inside. Inside the tent were boots, coats, food, cameras, and personal belongings. It looked as though the hikers had left in extreme haste. And outside the tent were footprints. Bare footprints. Some wearing only socks. Some apparently barefoot. The tracks led away from camp toward a forest nearly a mile away. In temperatures approaching negative 30 degrees Celsius. The rescuers followed them. And eventually, they found the first bodies. Under a large cedar tree at the edge of the forest lay 2 hikers, Yuri Krivonishchenko and Yuri Doroshenko. They were barefoot, wearing only thin underwear. Their hands were burned and torn apart. Branches above them were broken high up the tree, suggesting one or both had climbed it desperately, possibly trying to see the camp. Nearby was evidence of a small fire. It seemed the 2 men had tried to survive after fleeing the tent, but they froze to death. Then, rescuers discovered 3 more bodies between the cedar tree and the campsite, including Igor Dyatlov himself. The positions of the bodies were horrifying. It appeared they had been trying to crawl back to the tent. One woman, Zina Komogorova, was found face down in the snow. Another hiker had his hands clenched tightly against his chest. It looked like they were fighting against impossible conditions. 5 bodies had now been found, but 4 were still missing. And the worst discoveries were still ahead. Months later, after the snow began melting, rescuers discovered the remaining 4 bodies buried deep in a ravine. Unlike the others, these hikers were wearing more clothing. Some of it belonged to the dead members already found earlier, which suggested the survivors had stripped clothing from frozen bodies in a desperate attempt to stay alive. But the injuries on these 4 victims shocked investigators. One had catastrophic skull fractures. Another had crushed ribs so severe, investigators compared the force to a car crash. Yet strangely, there were almost no external wounds. No signs of a major fight. No obvious weapon injuries. And then came one of the most disturbing details of all. Ludmila Dubinina was missing her tongue. Parts of her eyes and soft facial tissue were also gone. To many, it sounded monstrous. But some experts later argued the damage could have occurred naturally after death due to decomposition and scavenging animals. Still, the image haunted the public imagination forever. Then, another strange discovery emerged. Some of the victims' clothing showed traces of radiation. The Soviet authorities suddenly became secretive. Access to the area was restricted. The investigation became vague and inconsistent. Rumors spread rapidly across the Soviet Union. People began asking terrifying questions. What could force trained hikers to flee half-naked into deadly darkness? Over the decades, countless theories have tried to explain the mystery. Some are scientific. Others are deeply paranormal. One theory claims an avalanche struck the camp. Investigators in recent years suggested shifting snow may have created enough pressure and panic for the hikers to cut their way out quickly. This could explain why they fled. But critics point out there were no obvious avalanche signs. And experienced hikers like Dyatlov would likely recognize safer terrain. Another theory suggests military involvement. During the Cold War, secret Soviet weapons tests were not uncommon. Some witnesses reportedly described glowing orange spheres in the sky near the mountains around the same time. Could the hikers have encountered explosives or experimental weapons? The radiation found on clothing fueled those suspicions. Then came the more paranormal explanations. Some believed the hikers encountered a Yeti or unknown creature. This theory became famous partly because of a recovered photograph jokingly labeled, "From now on, we know that snowmen exist." Others focused on the mountain itself. The Mansi people considered parts of the region spiritually dangerous. Stories spread that the hikers had disturbed something ancient. Others suggested infrasound, caused by wind patterns, may have triggered irrational panic and terror. A phenomenon where low-frequency sound physically affects the human mind. But no theory explains every detail perfectly. Not the injuries. Not the panic. Not the radiation. Not the strange behavior. and not the final moments of the hikers themselves. The Soviet investigation only deepened the mystery. Officials concluded the hikers died due to a compelling natural force. No detailed explanation. No clear cause. Just silence. Documents disappeared. Some files were reportedly classified. Photos from the investigation circulated for decades among conspiracy communities and paranormal researchers. The case slowly transformed from tragedy into legend. One of the greatest unsolved mysteries of the 20th century. In later years, Russian authorities reopened the investigation. Modern researchers leaned toward avalanche-related explanations combined with hypothermia and disorientation. Scientifically, it remains the most accepted explanation today. But emotionally, many people still feel something is missing. Because even if an avalanche explains the escape from the tent, it does not fully explain the terror. Imagine it. Pitch black wilderness. Screaming winds. Freezing air tearing through your lungs. And somewhere in the darkness, 9 experienced hikers believed staying inside the tent was more dangerous than running into the night barefoot. Whatever happened on Dyatlov Pass, those final moments must have been pure horror. And perhaps the most unsettling part of all is that the mountain still stands there today, silent, frozen, waiting.